Good morning. I invite you to open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14 is where we will spend most of our time this morning. As you're turning there, let me welcome everyone out this morning. Thankful for your presence and the opportunity for us to worship God together. There's a couple things I want to make mention before we get into the sermon. The first one is, of course, as Jason reminded us so well of the start of the new year. And as a congregation, we're going to begin a new daily Bible reading plan. And Nikki has printed out the schedule for that. If you'd like a copy of that, be sure to grab that as the new year begins. Something else I want to make mention for our young people. We usually have an event or a weekend in July for our young people, but this next year we're going to try something different. We're going to do that in January of just next month, January 26th and 27th. And so I just wanted to make parents and young people aware of that, to put that on your calendar. And we have a special guest that's going to be coming and speaking to the young people at that. His name is Jarrett Ferguson. He is a young preacher that preaches in Bowling Green, Kentucky. And the topic that he's going to speak on is Our God, He is Alive. And his lessons are going to center around how the existence of God shapes our worldview and how it affects everything about our lives. And I think our young people are going to be blessed by that weekend and by the message that Jarrett will share. He is a talented communicator. So I'm looking forward to that. And there'll be more information and the details about that will be coming out soon. Matthew chapter 14, at verse 13, I want to read to you there. Matthew chapter 14 at verse 13, it says, "Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns." Now, if you notice that first phrase there, that when Jesus heard what happened, I think it's important for us to understand what it is that Jesus heard happen. And if you go back in Matthew chapter 14, we read of the story of the death of John the Baptist, how Herod had put John the Baptist to death because of the daughter of Herodias, and she danced in verse 6 before the company, and it pleased Herod. And what Herod said is he promised with an oath, "I'll give you whatever it is that you ask." And her mother prompted her, "Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter." And eventually, of course, Herod gave in to that, and he beheaded John in prison. But what we see is that Herod had begun to think about Jesus, that it's John the Baptist, and John the Baptist is back. And so Jesus hears about, of course, the death of John the Baptist. He knows what Herod is thinking. And so when he heard what happened, it says that he withdrew. Now, I don't want you to think in any way that is Jesus being a coward and thinking, well, I need to run away because I'm in trouble. Jesus certainly knew that he was in trouble. He knew what was coming, but he knew that there was timing based upon the Father. And he knew that there was prophecy that would be fulfilled, and his time of departure was not yet coming. But it was a reminder to him, and it was a moment where he knew that he had to teach his closest disciples what was ahead for them. If you think about John the Baptist, who was the forerunner of Jesus, prepared the way for Jesus, and John the Baptist was put to death. And so as we read in Scripture, those who follow Jesus are going to be persecuted. And Jesus wanted to remind his disciples of what was ahead of them, but he also wanted to teach them something very important, something that they would need for the journey ahead. And I want us to think about what Jason said at the beginning of our sermon, or of our worship. I want you to think about the fact that the new year is beginning. And what do we need in the new year? What is it that we need most, not just in the new year, but what is it that we need most in our lives as we walk with Jesus? Well, I want to show you two stories that are really connected together in Matthew chapter 14 that teach the necessity of faith, but teach us some very important principles about how to develop faith, because it is faith that we will need in order to make it through this world. And when you think about faith, faith isn't something that is just caught. Faith is something that is taught. Faith is something that is learned. Faith is something that is practiced. Faith is something that is exercised. Just think about your physical muscles. Think about faith like a muscle. And so for a muscle to grow, for a muscle to develop, for it to become stronger, that muscle has to be stretched. It has to be torn down. It has to be fatigued. It has to be pressed to the limit. And I want you to consider this morning that that is exactly how faith is. Faith must be pressed. Faith must be stretched. And faith isn't something that you just either say, well, I have it or I don't have it, or, well, I wasn't born with it. It's not that way. Faith doesn't automatically just come to us. Faith has to be practiced. And so in Matthew chapter 14, we see how Jesus develops the faith of his disciples. And so as we begin to read this, I want you to think about your life. And I want you to think about those faith-stretching moments. We've all experienced those in our life. Those times when a trial, a struggle, something in our life has stretched our faith, has fatigued our faith, has torn down our faith, and it's been so stretched. How do we develop our faith to become stronger and stronger? Well, let's read. The first story begins as Jesus and his disciples withdraw. And I want you to notice in verse 14, it says, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, and he healed the sick. And so as Jesus hears this news, he takes his disciples, as we said, and they jump in a boat, and they head for a place where they can withdraw, where they can be alone. But somehow, this crowd knew where Jesus was going, and they made the trek all around the edge of the lake to where their boat would land. And so others, maybe from the towns, had heard the news, and they joined them. And so when Jesus and the disciples arrive, there is a large gathering of people there to meet Jesus. And maybe you can imagine how the disciples felt. Maybe they were looking forward to some downtime with Jesus, some one-on-one time with Jesus, but instead they get more people. They seem to get needy people, and there's more stress, there's more work. And so they saw this probably as an intrusion, but Jesus sees this as an opportunity. He sees this as an opportunity, and you'll notice that it says that Jesus had compassion on them. He had compassion on them, and he begins to heal the sick. That word compassion is a great word. It really means that his whole being was stretched, or that just deep down within him, this is like a gut level reaction that Jesus had. And I love that about Jesus, because Jesus was never looking at his watch. He was never bothered by the crowds. He wasn't aggravated and upset when his plans were disrupted by people. He was always available. He was always where his feet was. He was always in the moment. But as he's healing the sick, it goes on late into the afternoon, and the disciples are much like us. They're starting to get worried about dinner. They begin to think about food, and so they decide to tell Jesus what to do next in verse 15. It says, now when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves. Now that's the plan of the disciples. Now, later Matthew will tell us that there were 5,000 men in that crowd, not including women and children. And so just think about how that crowd probably doubled in size with that. And they have to eat, right? And so the disciples say, well, maybe they can go into the town and they can find some food in the nearby villages. And so they just need to go on and find their own food. But I wonder if the disciples themselves, were they thinking about eating? Were they thinking about their own plans? Were they the ones who were hungry? But yet they're saying, well, they need to go on and eat. But I think Jesus sees here another possibility, because the passage continues on in verse 16. And Jesus says, they need not go away. And he says, you give them something to eat. If you read in John's account in John chapter 6, Jesus looks at Philip and he says, Philip, where are we going to go buy bread that all of these people can eat? And so here he says, you give them something to eat. I just wonder if the disciples, maybe Thomas just rolled his eyes and he's thinking, Jesus is always saying things like this, always challenging them. But he was always challenging their assessment of the situation. What will they do? And so they give it to him straight. They say in verse 17, we have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish. Now, I'm wondering why they weren't thinking about the time in Cana in John chapter 2 when Jesus turned the water into wine and he provided there. They weren't thinking that. They just simply say, we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish, they answer. And so notice that they started with the negative. They say, we have here only. Maybe there's some sarcasm in their voice there. We only have this. And again, you've heard me say before that don't think a loaf of bread, think a small bun, just a small biscuit, if you will, or maybe a small roll. Think about that. Now, we know from John's account that it was a little boy's sack lunch. And so these were just barley loaves. This was food for the poor. And so we're not talking about much food here. And so for the disciples, of course, this wasn't much at all. But this was the basis for the action that Jesus was going to take. Look in verse 18. And he said, bring them here to me. Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied, and they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So the disciples say, we don't have enough, but Jesus decides that he's going to take over, and he's teaching an important principle here. But he directs all the people to sit down on the grass. It's time to eat. And he says that he looks up to heaven, and he gives thanks. He breaks the bread, and he starts passing it out to the disciples. And they begin to pass it on to the people. And it just keeps coming around until everyone ate, and there were 12 full baskets left over. I think about it. Did each disciple get their own basket? But it says they all ate and were satisfied. I just wonder what the disciples of Jesus there, what was Philip thinking as he was munching away on their own food there? They're happy, they're joyful, maybe a little bewildered about what just happened. How did that happen? And so is that the end of the story? No, it's not the end of the story. Notice in verse 22, the next word. Immediately, it says. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. So after Jesus performs this miracle and everyone eats and they're full and they're satisfied, it says immediately. Jesus says, come on, guys, get into the boat. We got to get out of here. There seems to be some urgency in this, and Matthew doesn't really tell us why, but in John's gospel, you can read in John chapter 6 at verse 15 that the crowds intended to come and take Jesus by force and make him king. So Jesus was concerned his own disciples, maybe they would be swayed by this grassroots campaign to take Jesus and to make him into the king that they wanted him to be. And so Jesus says, we got to get out of here quick. But the interesting thing is he's not going with them. Look what happens in verse 23. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. He went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now we saw earlier, Jesus tried to withdraw from the crowds. But now he's very intentional about making sure that this happens. But isn't it interesting that Jesus goes by himself and he prays? And I wonder in my mind, what is it that he prayed about? As he withdraws and talks to the Father, what was on his mind? Maybe he was still processing the death of John the Baptist. Maybe he saw that in light of his own impending death. The people wanted to make him king. Of course, he is King of Kings. But the people wanted to take him and make him king. Maybe there's temptation in that. But deep down, he knew that there would be no crown without the cross. And I think he needed to process that. He needed to go to the Father and pray to him. And so he prayed long into the night. And meanwhile, here's what's going on with the disciples. Look at the end of verse 23. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. So these guys, the disciples, they're well into their journey, but it's not going well. They're facing this strong headwind, this rising sea, and they were getting nowhere. They were no doubt exhausted. And they're in this dark, chaotic sea. But then another miracle takes place. Notice in verse 25, and in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." You'll notice there that it says that in the fourth watch of the night. In other words, this is the darkest part of the night. In the middle of this storm, here is Jesus just strolling across the lake. And his disciples see him, and it says, well, they think that he's a ghost. And they're thinking, well, this is it. We're done for. But Jesus says, take heart or take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. Those words, it is I, are very important. I'll come back to that. But look in verse 28. Peter has an idea when he hears this. Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus says, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Now I want you to notice that getting out of the boat was Peter's idea. I don't think it was a bad idea, but it wasn't initiated by Jesus. But Peter believes, well, if Jesus is walking on water, if Jesus gives me the command, so can I. And so Jesus invites him to come. And so Peter gets out of the boat. Oftentimes we focus on the fact that he began to sink. But notice the miracle here, that Peter walks on the water and he comes to Jesus. I don't know how far he got, but it says he came to Jesus. I don't know how far Jesus was. Maybe he's 50 yards or 5 feet. I don't know. But he walks on the water. But when his attention turned from Jesus and began to focus on the wind and the waves and the storm, he became afraid and he started to sink. It's interesting to me, Peter's name means rock. He didn't sink like a rock. He began to sink. And there's a reason why I think that is. I'll talk about in a moment. But then he does something smart. He does something smart. Notice what he does. He cries out, "Lord, save me." And it says immediately, Jesus reaches out and he pulls him up. But he says, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And so the next thing is that they're safe in the boat. The wind dies down. They're stunned in silence. And notice their conclusion in verse 33. And those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Truly you are the Son of God. This is the first time in Matthew's account where they worship him. They confess him to be God's Son. But I want to put these two stories together. I want to put them side by side. And I want us to see how these two stories show us how Jesus develops our faith. But the first important principle that I want us to grasp this morning is that we must focus on the object of our faith. This is so important to see, is that our faith can only grow as we get to know the object of our faith better. And what I mean by that is we have to understand that we don't have faith in faith. We have faith in Jesus. Jesus is the object of our faith. It's about Jesus. It's not about having confidence in our own selves, but confidence in Jesus. And so these two stories teach us something so important about Jesus, the object of our faith. Why is he worthy of our faith? Well, I think there's two things I want you to consider about Jesus here in this story. It's his humanity and his divinity. First of all, think about his humanity. I mentioned a moment ago that he knows his need for solitude, to get away and to pray. It's amazing to me when you think about that. That Jesus sends his guys out on the boat by themselves, and Jesus goes by himself and spends hours alone in prayer. Jesus is modeling for his disciples, he's modeling for us complete dependence on the Father. Even though he's God's son, he's human here. He's casting all of his cares on him. And I think if Jesus needed to do that, if God's son needed to do that, how much more so do I need to do that? How intentional am I about solitude and prayer with the Father? Do I regularly withdraw myself from all the things in this world that distract us and take our attention? Do I withdraw and spend time alone with the Father? We also see his compassion, though, as I mentioned, when his plan to withdraw from the crowd was interrupted. He was deeply moved by the needs around him, and he worked to meet them. He was compassionate. He understands people like no one else. It's like the old song, "What a friend we have in Jesus." But that's his humanity. For a moment, I want you to think about the fact that he is divine. Now, in the first story of multiplying the loaves and the fish, it was a reminder of Moses in the wilderness and how God provided manna for the Israelites. But here is Jesus, a prophet greater than Moses, who provided for his people. But on a deeper level, this miracle was a sign that pointed to an important spiritual truth. That as Jesus multiplied those physical loaves of bread, Jesus was in fact the bread come down from heaven. And think about it, just like that bread, he broke it and he blessed it and he gave it away. So himself, he did the same thing. He would be taken. His body would be broken on the cross. And he gave his life for us. But he's not only the bread of life. I mentioned that he says, "Take heart, don't be afraid, it is I." He's using the name that God gave to Moses when Moses said to God, "Well, who should I tell him sent me?" God said, "I am sent you." And "I am" went on to part the Red Sea. But here he doesn't part the sea, he walks on it. In Job 9 and verse 8 says, "He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea." And it's a reminder there's nothing in your life that he isn't able to handle. And so don't put your faith in faith. Put your faith in him. Get to know him. But how does he do that? How does he help us get to know him better? How is our faith in him developed? Let me share with you just a few things this morning. First of all, he puts us in situations where it's more than we can handle. I think in both stories we see this. He puts his disciples in a situation with the crowds to feed them where they were in over their heads. They couldn't handle it. They didn't have what it took to meet the challenge in front of them. When you've got thousands of hungry people there and you've just got a small sack lunch, but yet Jesus says, "You give them something to eat." That's impossible for them apart from his provision. Now think about in the second story. You see the same thing. They're in a storm. The winds were in their face. They'll never get to the other side of the sea on their own. Yet we know Jesus had put them in that boat. He put them in that situation for a purpose, to teach them that they didn't have what it takes to make it on their own, but he does. And it's a reminder that you can be living entirely in the will of God, in obedience to Him, and yet struggling in your life, struggling against the wind, and you think, I'm getting nowhere. You've heard the saying that God will never give you more than you can handle. The Bible doesn't teach that. He will often give you more than you can handle, but He will never give you more than He can handle. And He's there for us. He's there for us. He has what it takes to get us through every situation. And He does this to develop our faith in Him. The next thing I want you to see is that He uses what we offer to Him to meet needs. I think this is another part of just developing our faith. He wants you to offer up what you have, and He'll take it. What seems to be weak, what seems to be there's no way that what I have can accomplish anything for you, Lord, He's able to take it and meet the needs of others. What is just a small sack lunch in our hands becomes a surplus in His hands. Where they say, Lord, we only have this, but that's all Jesus needed. And He says to us, bring them here to me. Maybe some of you guys have seen a baseball player up to bat and they crack their bat. And they have to walk back to the dugout to grab their bat. I should have brought my bat. I've got a little Louisville Slugger bat. Somebody gave me one time. It's probably about that big. Maybe you know what I'm talking about that you get at the stadium. I mean, imagine your favorite baseball player. Mine was King Griffey Jr. Let's say he breaks his bat. He's walking back to the dugout, but yet there's somebody in the stands who says, hey, here, take this little bat I bought at the souvenir stand. You would think there's no way that he can go up to bat against a major league pitcher with a small bat like that. But what if he was to take that bat, step up to the plate, and hit a 420-foot home run? I mean, imagine that. We'd be wowed by that. And I just use that illustration to say of what Jesus can use for us or from us. Jesus can hit a home run out there in the wilderness that evening, but He can use the disciples' meager supplies to do it. And He didn't have to do it that way. I mean, you think about it. He could have just spoken a word and everyone would have had a full meal right in front of them. But He uses us. And He uses what we have to meet the needs of others. The next thing that I want you to see is that He invites us. He invites us to take steps of faith. And as we see with Peter, sometimes those steps of faith, oftentimes those steps of faith are risky. When Jesus says, come, think about Peter getting out of that boat. And I think about at that moment, that's really what faith is, or the development of faith, or faith's progression, if you will. Faith begins, first of all, just by understanding. It begins by understanding really the gospel and who Jesus is. But after you begin to understand the gospel, then you begin to kind of assent to it. In other words, now I understand it. Not only do I understand it, now I believe it. But then the progression is I understand it, I believe it, but then the next point is that now I am going to trust in Him. I am going to put my full weight on Him. And that's exactly what Peter did there. He believed that walking on the water, he was able to do that because he put all of his weight on Jesus. He believed that Jesus would take care of him, and that was real faith. He stepped out and he walked on water. As I mentioned, he got distracted, and when he did, he began to seek. But Peter's faith didn't fail completely. Let's not be too hard on Peter. And I say that his faith didn't fail completely for two reasons. First of all, when he began to sink, he yelled out the best thing that he could yell. Lord, Lord, save me. That's faith too. It seemed like he tried to get back to the boat on his own. He cried out to the Lord. He was driven in desperation, and Jesus was there for him. But secondly, I don't think Peter's faith failed because of this. When Jesus rebukes him, he doesn't say, Peter, you have no faith. He doesn't say that. He says, you have little faith. Well, I'd say little faith's better than no faith. Jesus calls it doubt. But doubt isn't just having no faith at all. There's certainly doubt is an attack on our faith, but the word means doubt means to be of two minds. And you know what I love about this? I love God's grace here. That Peter is, we're a lot like Peter. We're just like Peter. We get distracted. We take our eyes off Jesus. We have little faith mixed with doubt. We begin to sink. We cry out, but it's necessary for us to develop our faith. We don't develop our faith in the calm waters, but in the storm. That's where we develop our faith. But then finally, I want you to see this, that he satisfies us. He satisfies us and brings us to a deeper level of faith. And that's exactly what these two stories emphasize. It emphasizes in the story of the 12 disciples sitting on the grass, and as the evening is coming, the sun's setting, and there's 12 baskets left over. It says they all ate and were satisfied. Yeah, their bellies were satisfied, but I think there's something deeper than that. I think there was a satisfaction of the soul for the disciples of Jesus. All right, did you just see what happened? Can you believe he used that little lunch to do that? It's so good. They had a deeper level of faith after that. But in the second scene, Peter and Jesus step into the boat. And notice at the end of the story, it says when they got into the boat, those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." So they had this satisfaction with the loaves and the fish, but now that satisfaction turns to deeper faith, or it turns to worship. They see him like they've never seen him before. They say, "You are the Son of God." And I love the fact that it is a direct address. They're not talking about him. They are talking to him. Maybe they're flat on their faces in that boat worshiping. But I want you to understand, as we begin a new year, the most crucial thing you'll need is faith. And faith isn't just something, as I mentioned, that either you have or you don't have. Faith is something that must be learned. It is taught, and it must be exercised. It must be developed. But the good news is that God is there to help us. He's committed to doing that in our lives. And so he'll put us in situations where we can't handle it. He'll ask us to offer up whatever it is that we have in our hands, even though it seems insufficient for us. He asks us to give it over to him, and he invites us to take steps of faith, even though they're risky. But when we do that, our faith will develop, and we'll come to a deeper love and faith for him. If we can help you this morning in your walk with the Lord, if we can help you begin your walk with the Lord by having your sins washed away in the waters of baptism, or if we can help you with your relationship with God in any way, why don't you let us know while we stand and sing.